Good evening to all my listeners. Today we are going to continue our journey on listening the Bhagavad Gita volume 1, and today we are going to start with the chapter 3, the fleeting opportunity of the human births. It is we will understand verses 1.42 to 1 verses 1.43. So let's start. Admixtures of castes, indeed, is for the hell of the family and the destroyers of the family. Their ancestors fall deprived of the offering of rice, ball, and water. By these misdeeds of the destroyers of the family, bringing about confusion of castes, are the immemorial religions, rights of the caste, and the family destroyed. Now let's see what Acharya Prashant has to say about this verse. We have looked at the mental states of Duryodhana and Parth, and there was a great deal. We have looked at the mental states of Duryodhana and Parth, and there was a great deal to be learned from the trepidation and angst and sheer helplessness visible in Duryodhana's predicament. A great warrior, invincible with the mace, is actually anxious to the extent of breaking down. Just as Arjuna is candid enough to admit the same to Krishna. Duryodhana does not admit that visibly. He does admit that if you can, he does admit that he does admit that if you can read his state, but he does not acknowledge the sheer agony of his state in his own words. We wondered about the loss of truth and how human birth is a limited opportunity, and through the relationship between the ego and the truth is one of the eternal love. Yet life is not eternal, so that window of opportunity available to you is quite limited. Limited not just by the lifespans of us individuals, but by the very elasticity of consciousness. You can stretch yourself so far away from the truth that a return might become practically impossible. So we all know that the saints have sung of the glory of the limited time span available to us in our life as Homo sapiens. They have said that if you are born a human being, that's such a privilege and a rare opportunity. Better make use of it. Better make use of it. And through the relationship between the ego, by the truth is one of the eternal love, yet life not eternal, so that the window opportunity available to you is quite limited. Limited not just by the lifespan of us individuals, but by the very elasticity of consciousness. You can stretch yourself so far away from the truth that a return might practically be impossible. But even when we listen to them, it appears that the opportunity stretches over at least a few decades. The few decades of our lifespan, right? That's the kind of impression we get if we listen to the saints. So they will say, Durlab Manush Janam hai. The human birth is rare, and the moment you listen to this, you feel fine. As long as I am alive, the possibility remains open. I can redeem myself any instant. But when you look at the Duryodhana state, you discover that the opportunity is even more constrained. First of all, your lifetime is small, both limited and unpredictable. Secondly, on top of that, to make matters worse for us, the real window available to approach the truth is only a fraction of lifetime that is already very small. So, it is a small fraction of a lifetime. Bad news made worse by careful observation. Think of it. You hardly have any consciousness worth the word high before you are, let's say, 15. So, those 15 years you can immediately strike out from the opportunity available. That is gone. Last 5, 10, or 15 years of your life, you dragging your body somehow to the medical store, then to the dining table, then to the bed, eventually to the hospital, and then others will drag your body to the crematorium. So even that time cannot be counted as time available towards self-realization, right? Initial 15 years struck out. Last 15 years are not available. How many years remain in between? The average lifespan in India is still in the range of 70-75. How many years remain? Let's say 40. Out of these 40, between 50 and 35, one is so occupied with his or her desires, so smitten by the bugs of ambition and worldliness, that time simply flies. You do not realize when you turn 35 from 15. Safely, you can discount that time as well. Now, how much is the window that's left to you? 25 in these 25 years. If you can do something worthwhile, that's just 25 years, mind you. And that too, if you needed to indeed manage to match the average life expectancy. In these 75 years, if you manage to do something worthwhile, then life is worth it. Otherwise, it's an opportunity truly wasted. Duryodhana is a very dark example of that wasted opportunity. And he realizes that, and practically, Duryodhana being Duryodhana, it is impossible for him to rectify at this last stage. So he cannot say, I can keep wasting my life. I can keep drifting from the truth, the destiny, and someday after retirement, I will wake up and catch up. That cannot happen. That does not happen. Theoretically, yes. We keep saying that an opportunity is available even till your last breath. But as we said, that's only theoretical. In theory, it exists, but practically, that might be too difficult to achieve. It's like saying theoretically you still have a chance to win a match till the last ball is bowled. I am talking of a cricket match. Theoretically, yes. Last over 54 runs required. Theoretically, yes. There is a chance, but had the bowlers been that bad, they wouldn't have been able to push you down to such a pathetic situation, right? For you to score 54 of one over, the bowling side has to be actually really bad. But had they been that bad, how would you have been in a situation needing 54 of one? Equally, if you can score 54 of one over, you have to be a brilliant batting side. Now, if you are really a brilliant batting side, how do you find yourself in such a pathetic state? 54 needed of 6 balls. So only theoretically it is possible. Really, it cannot happen someone who never cared for the truth in his entire life. How will he suddenly gain realization in his last 6 months? So practically it has to be an continuous effort. Time is already short, and you cannot waste something you are already short on, right? In operation management, we know the concept of bad bottleneck. A good manager always focuses on the bottleneck variable, right? Focusing on the other things won't help. It's the bottleneck that really decides your throughput. In life, so many other things seem important. You feel like fighting so many other constraints, but really, those who have known have told us that the final setback is time. There is nothing in life as much in short supply as this one thing, time. And Duryodhana lost out on it. It's the most regrettable thing when you observe a life gone waste. That too, a life like Duryodhana's. He was Duryodhana from the beginning. We know that, right? Duryodhana, he was named as someone who would be glorious in war. Obviously, the guardians didn't mean only the war involves bloodshed. They were educated people. They were people who cared for something within. So when they named him Suyodhana, they wanted him to become someone who could win the internal war. And the war was, and he was well built, and he had firmness of purpose, and there are a lot of qualities you can attribute to him. Even if he had his vices, he was not alone in having them. Show me one character in Mahabharata that is absolutely virtuous, having no shade of evil at all. There is not a single character. You can keep Sri Krishna aside, give him the advantage of the fact that he is not a character. Keeping him aside, show me someone. And even Sri Krishna appearing as an avatar here had to bear the curse of Gandhari, right? There are a lot of things a lot of people cursed him for. So Duryodhana was an individual with a lot of potentiality. Think of what he could have been. Think of an alternative life that could have been possible. There is a beautiful play that has been composed on the same theme. Think of how everything would have been appended had Duryodhana decided to approach Krishna at an early age when he was still young. On the battlefield, you very well know all these are middle aged people, well into their 40s, 50s, and 60s. The Kauravas and the Pandavas, they are not young people really. And now, here stands someone who knows he has already lost it. Feel the fright. See how a chill run down your spine. You have already lost it, and you know that. It's an epiphanic moment, a sudden realization, a realization without doubt. You have seen it. It's the magic of the moment. Nothing has left ambiguous or uncertain. It's very clear to you. The story of your entire life has flashed in front of your eyes, like the flash of thunder in a dark night. Ever experienced that sudden flash of lightning and it's absolutely dark that 1 second and you can see everything, and that at which you see does not please or amuse you. It just tells you you have lost it and now it's too late to make amends. You want to be in the stage, and it's quite probable to land there. You have everything, you had all the opportunity and you probably were brighter than the rest, and you still lost. You want to be in that stage. So that's one thing that has not been very widely commented upon, but I think it deserves a lot of attention: the agony of Duryodhana and the message and the lesson it has for us. The lesson is very clear. Yes, the opportunity is there, but it's slipping away fast. And once it's totally gone, it's not that you would die, you would continue to still live. That's the very, very scary, spooky aspect of it. You will continue to live without any possibility, any hope of realizing the very purpose of life. You will continue to be as alive as the bark on a tree trunk. People will point at the tree and say, it's a living thing, and the bark very well known how alive it is. It's just attached to something alive. It's never something alive, but it is lost its own life back. There is no possibility. All that remains is the shedding. The further the future does not consist of realization that probability is gone. The future now consists only of physical death. That's the only significant event left for you. Death. The beauty of life lies in learning. Right? The beauty of life is when you know that you need a tomorrow because you will be better tomorrow. Otherwise, the flow of time is not needed at all. There who have called the flow of time as an illusion. Why do you need the flow of time? Why is the future needed at all? Future makes sense only if someone you can only if tomorrow you can be better, more learned, more liberated, right? And if you cannot be that, the time is simply a harassment. Imagine if there is no possibility left for you, no possibility of freedom. What is time for you now? Let's say you are jailed for life, and it's been assured that you are not to come out of the jail till your last breath. Now, tell me, what is the future for you? You are still physically alright, and probably you will live another 10, 20 years, and it's been arranged that you will spend the next 20 years in your cell, in the jail. Now tell me, what is the future for you? Just the prospect of more and more torture. What else is future? Because we live to be liberated, we live to grow, to learn, to become better, right? And if that possibility is closed, what is the future for you? Why must you live on? And Duryodhana has seen that. It's the worst feeling you can ever have in life, and I sincerely wish that none of you come to that. The feeling you that you already are dead, but you still have to continue walking for a few more decades till you drop dead. The realization that it's already over for you and you cannot even die. How do you then live through those remaining years? Tell me, please. Duryodhana was brilliant. He had realized he has already lost it. So sped so he sped up. He said, "Fine, let me then hurry towards my eventual destruction." The first day he realizes it's over for him. 18th day he is gone. So he has to bear it for a maximum of 18 days. Actually more than 18 days because he was not immediately dead after his battle with Bhima. But that's right. 18, 20 days, whatever. What if you close your opportunity for yourself at the age of 25 or 30? And it's quite possible. You can do that. You are still 25, you are maybe 30, 32 something, and you have shut the door on yourself. And you know that you will still continue to live. How terrible is that? Or is that not? Life is over and yet you are not dead. That's Duryodhana. And Duryodhana is lucky because he was at least honest enough to stand squarely against Krishna. That's an indicator of some kind of long love gone way. Even if he is arranged against Krishna, he is at least facing Krishna. People do that in love, no. They want to look at you, so they will stand or sit opposite to you. If you beloved is sitting here, there, you won't want to be somewhere behind her or next to her or away from her. You will want to be seated right opposite to her. So Duryodhana at least had that degree of honesty. He said, "Fine, if I can't be by his side, I can't be an Arjuna. I will at least directly opposite to him." So he got liberated pretty soon. He didn't have to bear the agony of living through lifeless decades. What if you are neither with Krishna nor against Krishna, simply indifferent to Krishna? That's how most people are. They don't even have the guts, the honesty, the love to openly defy Krishna. They won't come out in open. Even their opposition lacks sincerity. Even in their enmity, they have no sincerity. So they are simply away. They are not fighters, they are not deceivers. They will not openly defy Krishna. They will decisive, they will say, "We are with you, we are in your army." And when somebody says that he belongs to your own army, that fellow gets the right to stand behind your back, right? And when the fellow gets the right to stand behind your back, he can stab you in the back. Duryodhana cannot stab Arjuna or Krishna in the back. That much honesty he has. He has ensured he is standing right in front. The worst way to express your enmity with Krishna is to belong to his army. Even if you don't stab him in the back, you can at least snore at the back. The general is expecting that the army is all set for war, but here you are. He is standing facing the enemy, and the soldiers are snoring. The soldiers don't even have the guts to cross over, declare that they are in opposition, and simply go to the other side. The soldiers don't have that guts, so they will continue to be arranged behind the leader and they will stab or snore from there. Duryodhana was sincere, so it got over pretty quickly for him. For most people, it does not get over pretty quickly. The punishment is that one has to live on. Now we want to understand how Arjuna understand Arjuna states. Let's put the Gita in perspective. What is the Arjuna state stands for? Right, point wise. Because only when you understand that Arjuna stands for you will you understand the very purpose of Gita. The Gita exists to solve a problem posed by Arjuna. The Gita exists to truly defeat certain arguments made by Arjuna. The Gita is a discourse against Arjun's position and as insinuated in chapter 1, right? What is Arjuna's position? Write down point wise. You cannot have just 2 or 3 points, and a lot of points you will come to be by way of implication. So exercise your mind. So that's a task for you viewers. You can understand the and list down the arguments made by Arjuna on a pen and paper, and we will later learn that how will Krishna come with a solution to his arguments. What can a solution mean to you if you do not know the very problem which is being solved? Truth is supposed to dissolve the mind, right? We want to know the mind of Arjuna. The 17 chapters after the first one are an attempt to resolve the mind of Arjuna. But where are the knots? What is the that stands crystallized within Arjuna's mind? What is that Krishna is seeking to work on? Where are the tumors that the expert surgeon is trying to remove? So now we will listen to a talk between a questioner and Acharya Prashant. So you can also relate to him, because I guess that some questions might be arising in your minds too. So questioner is asking here attachment, fear. So Acharya Prashant is answering yes, attachment, fear. These are biological. So first is attachment, obviously biological. Second is fear, probably yes. The biological part is over here, attachment and fear. Now you come to the social part. So the questioner is asking about the religious beliefs that Arjuna has. So, questioner is further simplifying his question that the religious belief that Arjuna has is that he is believing that giving water and rice to the dead ancestors will give them peace. So Acharya Prashant is answering. So by implication, what does that mean? What he is actually believing in? The questioner is saying that Arjuna is here believing in Vedic Karam Kand, the teaching he has gone through. Once you say that it's important to offer tarpana to the dead ancestors, what is that you are fundamentally believing in? There is a particular concept behind it, the individual soul, the questioner asks. Acharya Prashant answers, the Jivatma, right? That there is something called a Jivatma that transmigrates. So that's the principle behind Arjuna. Transmigration of the soul or Jivatma. That's where Arjuna is coming from, and that's something the Gita stands to dissolve and attack. Very interestingly, in favor of the principle of transmigration of the soul, people have been quoting the Gita, whereas the Gita exists to deny that principle. That's exactly what Arjuna is standing as his position, right? If kids are the wrong kind of caste combinations are born, then they will be very bad for all the departed souls. So you started from there. Fine. The principle of transmigration of the personal soul. What else does Arjuna believe in? So the questioner is answering that Arjuna later believes in the caste system. So let's understand Acharya Prashant's take on this. Acharya Prashant, caste system. What else does Arjuna believe in? Women as property. It's very patriarchal mindset when he says that, women should not be allowed to mingle with people from the so-called lower castes, as if women cannot decide on their own, as if Arjuna is the great and final patriarch on whom rests the responsibilities to protect women's chastity and mind. What else does Arjuna believe in? Rituals. It's very ritualistic mindset, and that's the reason why Sri Krishna has to attack the Karma Kanda portion of the Vedas again and again in the ensuing chapters. So ritualism, patriarchy bordering on misogyny, superstition and caste. By today's yardstick, what Arjuna has said in chapter 1 is quite offensive. That was the going system in those days, so one must not judge him right there, because people operate according to the values of their own time and age. You cannot apply today's standards to an Arjuna that was 2500 years back. But still, we see that Krishna is up against. We, we now clearly see how formidable is the challenge. We also see how contemporary is the challenge. Do you see that it's not easy to tackle someone who carries that kind of a social load? And if you don't believe me, then try someone who believes in those things. Try arguing with him. Krishna obviously has the advantage of proximity and also authority. Arjuna, to a great extent, had already accepted Krishna as the authority, an authority that was standing approximate to the learner. Arjuna already was someone who was open to learning. So Krishna had these two advantages. But even those advantages, it is a very uphill thing to tackle someone with that kind of a mental load. And we have listed 4 points under the social tab. Forget all four someones who carried even just one of those is going to be a tough nut to crack. Try talking someone out of his patriarchal beliefs. You will understand what I mean. Try talking someone out of caste. Next to impossible. Now you know what do when you battle these kinds of problems and mindsets. Krishna didn't believe directly talk to these things. Instead, he introduced Anjuna to the self, which basically means look at the Krishna's method. Not just by words, look at the method he had chosen, which basically means that if you want to tackle caste, patriarchy, ritualism, or superstition, then the only tool is self knowledge. You cannot simply declare these are evil and sins or vices and hope that the population will discard these things. That won't happen. Now, you also know that do when you would battle these kinds of problems and mindsets, Krishna didn't directly talk of these things. Instead, he introduced Arjuna to the self, which basically means look at the Krishna's method, not just by his words, look at the methods he had chosen, which basically means that if you want to tackle caste or patriarchy or ritualism, or superstition, then the only tool is self knowledge. You cannot simply declare these as evil or sins or vices and hope that the population will discard these things. That won't happen. That's why you find that, in spite of very liberal education, people still continue to be the easiest. That's why you find that even scientists are extremely superstitious at times, because it is self knowledge that will defeat superstition, not just science. I am not denying the important role of science. I am saying that science alone will not succeed. Could science alone succeed? Krishna would have just taught Arjuna science. Krishna doesn't teach Arjuna science. Arjuna is superstitious. Krishna doesn't teach him science. Arjuna is a casteist. Krishna doesn't teach him Marxist revolution. Not because that revolution is something abhorrible or incompatible with spirituality, simply because it won't succeed. It won't succeed. So Krishna doesn't launch himself into a diatribe against casteism and other evils. So he doesn't do that. Once Arjuna has finished speaking, Krishna comes directly to self knowledge, who you are. Once you know who you are, all these problems are attacked at their root. Once a fellow started developing a degree of self knowledge, you do not then need to additionally tell him not to be the casteist. If you are a casteist, that simply means you have zero self knowledge. If you are superstitious or ritualistic, it simply means you have zero self knowledge. Introduce self knowledge, and all these things will vanish like they never existed. You won't even need to talk about them or attack them directly because they are long gone. There is some jaggery kept there behind her, referring to someone in the audience back. So, a lot of flies are there in the room, 144 of them. What do I do? Fight each one of the 44 of the 144? Is that the way? There are 144 mental and social evils arising from the body, some coming from society. What do I do? Fight each of them individually. Imagine there is a lump of jaggery kept somewhere, and what am I busy doing? I am chasing individual flies with a sweater. This kind of wisdom is the last thing we can associate Sri Krishna with. He is not going to do such an obviously senseless thing. What does he do? He picks up that unwanted stuff in the room of Arjuna's mind and throws it out. What is that lump of jaggery to be called? What is that called? This is called ego. Another name for ego is self illusion, right? It believes in something that does not exist and call it as a self. That's ego, self illusion. I tremendously believe in something that actually has no existence. Not only do I believe in it, I think of that thing as self. That's ego, self illusion. That's the unwanted lump kept at the center of our existence, and it attracts a lot of flies and other stuff. So Krishna says, no, 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 it's pointless debating caste or women with Arjuna. I know where all of it is coming from. I will immediately hit at the center. What do you call it these days? Headshot. Finished. No point beating around the bush. And believe me, if Krishna chooses to beat about the bush, a thousands of Gita will not suffice. Such is the grip of these things on the mind. In Hindi, they say that which never goes is called caste, but in English, in translation, it loses its bite. The bite is there in the vernacular. जो कभी नहीं जाती वो है जाति. So a thousand Gita and a thousand year will not suffice. Caste is something you just cannot get rid of by arguing directly against caste. That is something you can attack only through self knowledge. Only through self knowledge is the solution. You know what is happening to the US these days? When we had the first few waves of migrants crossing over the US and Canada, they were mostly upper class people from India. I am talking of Indian migrants. Now, since the last 20 years or so, or 20-30 years, a lot of the so-called lower caste students and professionals also are started to moving to the US. So what happened was that Indians went and there and carried caste even to those ashore destinations. They say when an Indians go abroad, there are two things he definitely carries with him. One is pickle and the other is caste. He cannot leave these things back in India. You cannot say I am going there, but I cannot carry pickle. The mother or somebody, aunt, bua, fufi, will definitely push a sizable can of achar in your luggage. Pick in the luggage and cast in the mind. So they have now pushed legislation there, and they have said that caste is now an acknowledged form of discrimination. And a lot of Indians were quite unhappy at that. It's happening, it's currently in the news. A lot of upper caste Indians are very unhappy. They say, we don't know what caste is. You see, we are modern progressive people. We are immigrants actually, and you are giving the natives something to beat us up with. This they will call all of us as castes. But if such a step was needed to be taken, these actually was some rationale behind it. The fact is, the Indians indeed do carry caste whenever they go, and the caste discrimination, that caste consciousness had started showing up even in the North America. So the society and the government there decided to do something about it. Think of it, how is caste so eternal, so long lasting? They say a cat has 9 lives. Caste has more than 99, or at least it doesn't just die. Now you see why I am calling Krishna's challenge as formidable. It's very difficult to wipe out these things off somebody's mind, especially of the mind of Kshatriya belonging to the upper class. He is simply saying, I cannot bear to see my Kshatriya women mating with low caste unworthies. That's what Arjuna is saying. That's the kind of challenge Krishna is facing. Do you see this? And there are several other mindset issues that Arjuna is facing that you can draw by implication. For example, if someone believes in caste and is superstitious and believes in the transmigration of soul and such thing, what Arjuna is saying is, I believe that once people die, there is something called the soul that goes to a place is called Pitraloka, and there it continues to stay alive till it is liberated. And when it is liberated and such things, it somehow one believes in all those things, then it is also quite likely that the fellow must be demonstrating a lot of other problematic systems in his life. Now, Look at Krishna's delicate position. He is fighting for Pandavas, right? Krishna has arranged himself on the side of the Pandavas. Arjuna would be wielding an important position of power if Krishna's side wins. Correct. If Krishna wins, Arjuna will get a lot of authority in the kingdom. Would be not, he not? So Krishna is basically fighting and teaching to give a lot of authority to Arjuna and others. There are others, but Arjuna is being the principal one. Arjuna will get his fair share of authority, won't he? So Krishna knows that I am fighting to give a lot of authority to Arjuna. And look at Arjuna, what kinds of attitude he is displaying. Is he going to govern the kingdom with this value system? Krishna must be horrified because it is Krishna's personal responsibility. Right, Krishna is saying, personally, I am vouching that Arjuna is better than Duryodhana or Karna. Otherwise, what is the need for the battle? Otherwise, Duryodhana can be allowed to have the kingdom. The battle is being fought ostensibly to give the people of Hastinapur the best ruler possible. That's the very purpose of the battle, right? If a great ruler is not to be provided to the kingdom, then the battle is totally unnecessary. Anybody can rule. The battle exists so that the kingdom can have the best ruler. Now Arjuna is supposed to be a part of the ruling combination. These are five brothers, and Arjuna is one of the senior and the best fighters among the five. So Arjuna will surely have a pole position in the ministerial portfolio and everything. And who is Krishna awarding that pole position to? A casteist, a superstitious person, ignorant of the self. So Krishna would be totally horrified. He would be saying, "What am I doing?" If he is displaying these tendencies, I am sure he is he actually even better than Duryodhana? Because if you look at Duryodhana, he has accepted Karna even when it was not certain what caste Karna belonged to. In fact, it was more certain that Karna did not belong to any of the prime castes. He was taunted as a Sita Putra, charioteer's son, his entire life because his father used to take care of horses and chariots. So Duryodhana didn't have that strong caste element in his mind. At least from that instance, we can draw some kind of conclusion. Not a very strong conclusion, but we can get a faint idea. So when it comes to the caste thing, Duryodhana looks better off than Arjuna, and Krishna must be wondering, why am I on this side? And will I make this man the king or the minister or the commander in chief of the army? Will I become responsible for that kind of a misstep? So now you see that the Gita is in some sense the Gita is an expression of Krishna's personal responsibility. Krishna is saying, since I have taken it upon myself to make the Pandavas victorious, therefore I take upon myself that the victorious party will not remain unworthy of ruling Hastinapur, because my job does not stop merely at defeating Duryodhana. My real job was the establishment of Dharma. That's what I am really fighting for. And Dharma means that the king has to be someone who is self illuminated. Otherwise, how is Dharma being established? And this fellow, look at chapter 1, what kind of dribble is his talking? How far he is from self realization. And tomorrow he sits on the throne, and people will blame me. They will say, "You made him sit on the throne." Now see all kinds of casted step he is taking. He has all the power and the authority now. He is saying only Kshatriyas are qualified to take up important position. Is that not quite likely? Look at Arjuna's mind and look at the kind of things he is saying. Had Arjuna succeeded in going to the throne, remaining as he is in chapter 1, think of how he would have done to the administration. Would he have allowed women in important position? And he would have patronized all kind of superstitious priests, and he would have wasted the treasury on all kinds of hollow rituals. No, those rituals are very expensive, and priests will come and say, 2,000 animals have to be slaughtered and a great temple has to be built. Otherwise, the country will suffer with famine and drought. You should build that great temple. Now, even if the treasury cannot support the construction of that temple, yet it has to be done because that's what the priests are saying. Now, is this a kind of a king good for the kingdom? So Gita becomes Krishna's personal responsibility to purge Arjuna's mind. Otherwise, Krishna would have said, "See, it's not a question of your running away. If you don't improve, I will run away because I cannot take it upon myself that I gave this kind of a king to Hastinapur. And how will I justify Duryodhana's death? I ensured that the entire huge army defeated and all those mighty warriors are killed just go so that this kind of a man can succeed to the throne. By throne I mean the position of power. Now, don't counter me by saying that Yudhishthir would have been become the king, not Arjuna and all those. Keep that aside. Think of the churn inside Krishna's minds. These are the thoughts in his mind. He is saying, is Arjuna, is who is he is, as has displayed in chapter 1. What am I doing to supporting Arjuna? Why should I support him at all? So he has to improve. Else he doesn't deserve to win. Else he doesn't deserve to have me by his side. Think of even Karna. Even Karna is not ritualistic. Arjuna is so vulnerable to his physical self, right? Karna, if we believe what the Mahabharata says, had been told that the great secret had been let out. It has been disclosed to him by Krishna himself that his body belongs to the Pandavas, that he is in fact their eldest brother, and yet he was able to overcome bodily affiliation. Think of Karna. He has been told that the side of which his body belongs, and his body definitely belongs to the Pandava side. All five are his brothers, and that two younger ones. And Krishna told him, "You go there, and they will touch your feet. You are the eldest one, elder than even Yudhishthir." And he told all this to the Karna in quite a poetic and compelling way. He said, "Two of them will wash your feet, two will stand behind you, and one will guard you." And more poetic stuff. Very alluring, Karna said, "Fine, no need." And on the contrary, you see Arjuna being carried away at his physical associations. Karna was the one who could persist his physical associations, right? Do you see that? Equally, Karna's allegiance to Duryodhana is not ritualistic or social. It is coming straight from his core. He is saying, Duryodhana supported me in my lowest hour. How do I ditch him now? When I was a nobody, he pulled me up. He honored me. He actually granted me an entire kingdom. Otherwise, I was just coming from a very ordinary place. He made me Anga Raja, king of Anga. So, how do I deceive him now? Now, that's not ritualistic, mind you. This position is not ritualistic. This position is an expression of deep inner values, personal values, not social values, personal values. So Krishna must be wondering, in some way, Duryodhana is better than this chap. In another way, Karna is better than this chap. What am I doing to support him? What am I doing supporting him then? When it comes to resisting the body and the biology, Karna is superior to him. Why must I support Arjuna? Because it's not a matter of who has been my friend since long. It's a matter of gifting the right king to the people of Hastinapur. That's the entire purpose of the war. That's what is meant by the establishment of dharma. My likes and dislikes are aside. My personal preferences aside. How can I let somebody like this ascend to the throne? Yes, I love Arjuna. He is not just my disciple. He is my friend. We have spent so many beautiful years together, and we have laughed and had merry, as friends do. But still do my accountability is not just to one person, but to the entire population of the nation. So I have to ensure that only the worthiest fellow succeeds to the throne. And what Arjuna is displaying here is surely not symptoms of worth. Now, do you see the whole thing? Is there some perspective now? Do you see where the Gita is coming from? Do you see the pressure that Krishna is experiencing? Can you clearly identify Arjuna's position? Can you see that Arjuna's position is not historical but very, very current, extremely topical, very relevant, very contemporary? None of that Arjuna is saying is something unseen today. Look at all the points you have listed. Each one of them is presented today as well, and very strongly at that, right? That's what makes the Gita immortal. That's what it will make the next 17 chapters speak to you. That also tells you that if you have problems belonging to any of these points, then seek no other solution. The only solution is self knowledge. Where do all the problems of the individual and the world come from? Self illusion. Because you do not know yourself, so you create a mess within and without. Simple full stop. You look at any rubbish prevalent anywhere without thinking a second, you could immediately declare it is coming from self illusion. Declare first and argue it out later. Declare first because that's certainty. And if there is a problem of any kind anywhere, it can arise only from one thing, lack of self knowledge. Having declared that, now you can think the whole thing through. Now you can argue it out and create the various linkages and ask yourself how exactly self knowledge leads to this one thing. Obviously, when you will think through the thing, you will be able to establish a whole sequence of arguments, and that's not too difficult. But faith comprises, and that's the definition of faith now. Faith comprises looking at anything that is ugly and immediately declaring without battling an eyelid, and it is coming from a lack of self knowledge. There are no problem except the mother problem, and the name of the mother problem is ego. There is no other problem. So don't wonder too much about your problems. The moment you find yourself in a mess, in a soup, just tell yourself it is just my lack of self knowledge. Now, how is it your lack of self knowledge you can attribute to think about that? All day think about that. How it is your lack of self knowledge? But first of all, immediately acknowledge that this is nothing apart from lack of self knowledge. That must be instantaneous. The argument I am saying, you can continue to build for 2 more days. You can take all the time that you want, but the declaration has to be instantaneous. So, should we conclude without thinking? In this matter, yes, and that's called faith. Your problem is you think where thought should not interfere, and you know when you think where thought should not interfere, that completely simply jeopardizes thought. Even your thought loses its quality. You think so much, and there is no power in your thinking. Your true thought is like a lame and a limp man trying to run, trying to cover a distance. How will he manage? Is faith that provides life to thought? But this thing applies only to the mother question. Do not start applying this thing to any other question. The mother question is, what is the mother cause of any problem that I see anywhere? And the answer to that has to be, I am saying instantaneously, the ego. In other matters, do not start playing the trick. Otherwise, you will be called, and you deserve to be called by God. So, the 42nd verse. When the caste mixes, obviously Arjuna at work here. When the caste mixes, that spells hell for the family. It destroys the family in the way that ancestors all fail or fall because they are deprived of the pindo ka, pindo ka kriya. Pindo ka kriya. Pind means a lump, a ball. So there is some ritual involving making a pind, ball of grains, rice, etc., and then offering it to the deceased ancestors. That is offered. Some other stuff is offered. Even clothes are offered. Water is offered. Food is offered. Flowers are offered. A lot of milk is offered. Yogurt is offered, and all that is supposedly meant to please the ancestors who are hungry for those things. For a long time, it has been the ritual that once the person is gone, then you send behind him all the things that a person needs in his journey. Because the deceased soul, the Jivatma, is supposed to be on a journey. So you have to give them all the things that they need in the journey. So first of all, it's very dark here, so you give them light. Again and again, you have to offer them light, especially when the sun is setting. Then it is ensured that you offer them light. Otherwise, they will not be able to see, that they will stumble. In many places, it still happens that you offer them vehicles. Obviously, the vehicles are cornered by Pandit, the priests. It is still a common sight to see somebody being offered a bicycle, and the bicycle supposedly goes to the one traveling through the various lokas. Food has to be low caste. Food has to be offered daily. They are hungry. So that's what Arjuna is referring to. And those things can be offered only by someone of the right pedigree and the right relationship. So if your pedigree is not right, which means you are not coming from the right kind of father and mother, then your offering will not be accepted. In fact, the ancestors will get angry, and they get angry. You better watch out. Anything can happen. That's what Arjuna is referring to, the mighty warrior. And Krishna is saying, have I already made a mistake in supporting him? If I have, then I will make them amends. The Gita, you could say, then is an exercise in compensation. Now that I have decided to support him, I better educate him as well. Otherwise, the fault will be all mine. If Hastinapur gets a superstitious ruler, the fault will be all mine. So these are the next verses. These are the destroyers of the family. Who are the destroyers of the family? Those who marry in the wrong caste are the destroyers of the family. And by these wrong deeds of such people who destroy the family by bringing out the wrong kind of union of caste, the immemorial, the timeless religious rights of the caste are destroyed, and the family too is destroyed. So you could add another point to your list. The wrong kind of family system is what Arjuna supports. You also you also see now how the family system is intertwined with the caste system, at least in India, how these two go together hand in hand, the family and the caste. You see how the family, the caste, the rituals and the superstitions, they are all are one now. Now you would also see why a lot of learned people did not look too favorably upon the institution of marriage. Now do you see that? Because these things are all together. Family, caste, rituals, superstitions, and so many other things. And at the root of all them is self-illusion or self-ignorance. You will not find any self-realized man frantically advocating the institution of marriage or family. They have either been indifferent or have sometimes actively denounced for this reason, because all these things go together. You remember Sadripu, the six enemies. By the way, you have also listed down 6 points by now. And when we talked of Sadripu, we said these six always go hand in hand. And a family of six, a bundle of six, these six that you have jotted down, they two go together, and that's why it is difficult to fight even any of them individually. You attack them, you will find you have attacked everything. You also know nothing that if you attack the mother problem, which is a lack of self knowledge, where all the stouts of resilience will come from. If you are someone trying to bring self knowledge to the people, look at the points you have noted, and you will immediately realize which are the places that will oppose you the most. You can predict that. It's so mechanical. If you talk of self knowledge, these are the places and the places that will coerce. And if you are killing them because you are actually killing them, people who advocate superstition, people who advocate caste, all these people who demean women, people who are not concerned with self knowledge but with various kinds of stories like that, people who talk of Jeev Atma, people who talk of floating spirits, they are the ones who will attack you vehemently as if these their lives are being threatened. And you will say, but I never spoke anything against you, at least. I only talked of self knowledge. And they will say, self knowledge is like poison to us. If you talk of self knowledge, you still see daggers out. You will see daggers out because we are insects that can survive only in the darkness of self ignorance. And if you're trying to throw light upon us, the moment our light hits us, we die. You are our enemy. You are our killer. How we tolerate you? So we have to oppose you. Do you see what is happening? Do you see why the Gita is so dangerous? Do you realize that the war is being fought right now? The Gita does not talk of an ancient war, it talks of the war right now. Do you also see how difficult it will be for you to remain with the Gita and Krishna? If you have a particular attitude towards women or towards caste or something, do you see that? Now go close to your core and ask yourself, what is your attitude towards women? What would be your attitude towards your wife specifically? Because Arjuna is specifically concerned about wives. What will happen to the wives after we die? We possessed them while we were alive, and I cannot bear to think that my wife will be mating with someone else, especially a so-called lower caste person, after I am gone. So we want to possess them even after our death. That's the kind of attitude he carries towards wife. What to do? And you could add another point to your list now. When we come to the next word, this is a word he uses there here. Anusuru sruma. You know what that means. It has come to me by way of hearing. I have just heard. Arjuna says, you know, I have heard, dear Krishna, that all going to hell is inevitable for those men. Also mind that Arjuna is not so concerned about the place the women will go after their death. He is very worried about the resonance that the men folk will get once they are gone. So, O Krishna, I have heard that getting permanent residence in hell is inevitable for those men in whose families the various rituals have been abandoned. So, you can add one more point. Someone who has not made a primary and individual study of scriptures, he goes by hearsay. That's Arjuna for you. I have heard that this kind of thing happen, but please, you could have read the Upanishads. At least you could have engaged with Krishna in some deep conversation. Krishna was with you since decades, and if you are still saying all these things, what does that tell you about you? Arjuna, what were you talking about Krishna all those years? That should hit you like a boulder on the head. Just being with a learned one does not suffice. Saying you knew I lived close to him does not matter at all. Look at the kind of attitudes Arjuna is displaying in spite of being best friends to a Krishna. When did you really initiate a conversation? Looking at the verse, you really feel there was ever a conversation on this topic? Please tell me. This apparently is the first time Arjuna is opening his mind to Krishna. Otherwise, they were talking about all things, various things. Arjuna liked a particular woman belonging to Krishna family, you know very well, and he disclosed that to Krishna. And Krishna said, "Fine, I will help her elope with you." So those things were discussed. These things were never discussed, and now the thing is coming up at most inopportune time. Right when the first burst is about to fire, Arjuna reveals his dark side, and Krishna is wondering what's going on. What is he saying? And he never talked of these things all these years. He has the greatest archer in shining armor. Now all the shine is gone. Forget the armor. There is no shine even on his face. Now he is talking of all these dead and dark things. What a moment he has chosen. Arjuna has made no study of Upanishads. Otherwise, he would have known that the self is what the body is, and that there is nothing called hell and heaven, and that the so-called other worlds would just do not exist. And if they exist only in the mind. Even the world exists only in the mind. So even if you want to claim that the world exists only in your mind, Arjuna has made no study of that sort. When it comes to Vedanta, Arjuna looks totally uneducated. That's why Arjuna is you. Do you resonate now? Now study. Otherwise, you can a reader of a knower of Vedanta talk of such things. You know, that is the most uncomfortable chapter for you, right? After this, a lot of Jannah knowledge and that you have specialized is assimilating without absorbing. You take it in and you let it out without any absorption happening in between. This chapter is probably the most important chapter and the most underrated chapter in the Gita. Please skip it over it because people skip it over because Krishna is not yet speaking. Why must we listen what Arjuna is saying? But son, the first thing in self-realization is self acknowledgement, and self acknowledgement can happen only in chapter 1. That is where your self is. Chapter 2 onwards, there is only Krishna. You are found only in chapter 1. So read chapter 1 40 times and acknowledge that this is you. So we won't let it come to a quick end. I will reserve more agony for us, at least till the next session. So here we comes to the end of our verse 1.343 of chapter 3 in the Bhagavad Gita book. Tomorrow we will listen to the remaining verses.